That passage from Hebrews is probably one of the most well-known passages about faith that we have in the New Testament. It looks back and builds on the great men and women of faith in the Old Testament. So what I want to look at this morning are 5 aspects of faith that come out of that passage and that are illustrated by the life of Abraham. Now, unusually for me, I've got 5 aspects, all starting with the same letter. I don't normally manage this, but I've got 5 C's this morning, 5 C's of faith. So, first, we've got a faith that is called. God called Abraham. He called him to pack up and leave the place where he was living and go off on a journey to a new place. And what I want us to notice here is that God is very vague about what he says to Abraham. In Genesis 12, where this story obviously comes from, we have, the Lord said to Abraham, "Leave your country, your people, and your father's household, and go to the land I will show you. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing." Now, God doesn't tell Abraham where he's going, or what he'll do when he gets there, or how he will become a great nation, or how he will be a great blessing. But that doesn't stop Abraham from packing up his tent, his worldly goods, and following God's call. Abraham had a faith in God, a faith that God would be true to his word, and that God would do what he said he would do. Abraham's faith was strong enough for him to leave his family, his friends, his home, and head off into the unknown, which, if we're honest, was really a very vague, open-ended promise from God. But what Abraham did was to exercise that faith by responding to God's call on his life. He didn't start arguing with God as to why him, where is he going, how is he going to get there, what's he going to do when he gets there. God called him, and he went. Now, one of the characteristics of God is that he's the same. God is consistent. Yesterday, today, forever. And so perhaps it's no surprise that when we come to the New Testament, to where Jesus calls those first disciples, his call to them is equally vague, isn't it? Jesus says, "Come, follow me, and I will make you fishers of men." Again, there's no explanation as to what, how, why, and what is fishing for men. But by faith, those first disciples left what they were doing and followed Jesus and his call on their lives, even though they'd got no idea what they were letting themselves in for. Peter had no idea where it was going to lead him, following Jesus' call on his life. So the question that follows that is, what about us? All of us are called by God. And a bit later in the service, we say the creed where we declare our faith in the God who has called us. Is our faith like that faith of Abraham and the disciples? Do we have the faith to respond to God's call in our lives, even though we don't know where it's taking us? Newton's responded, hasn't he, to God's call in his life. He doesn't know where that call is going to take him in 5, 10, 15 years' time. But that's not stopped him responding to God's call, uprooting his family, leaving his friends and moving away to train as a priest. Do we have that hope, that faith for what is certain, for what we don't see? How many of us would want more information before we started out on that journey that Abraham did? Would we want to know where we're going, what the destination is, how it will get there, how long will it take? Is it a safe journey? We don't know what through Abraham's mind. And there's no indication that God gave him answers to those sorts of questions. But I also wonder what his wife, Sarah's, reaction would have been when he came back and told her, I've just met with God, so we're going on a journey. Pack up everything, we're not coming back. She had a faith as well, didn't she? And he was brave. But we'll come back to Sarah in a bit. Do we have that faith to trust in God, the faith to step out into the unknown, to follow God's calling in our lives? Abraham knew what that ultimate goal was, that he would be made into a great nation. And we know our ultimate goal, that we will spend eternity in heaven. But what God didn't give to Abraham and doesn't give to us is the detail between now and then, other than the faith to follow God's calling. Faith is a calling. Faith is also costly. There's a cost to responding to God's call on our lives. God's call on Abraham's life meant that he left his family, his friends, his position in the community, the life he knew. In exchange for that, he took his wife, his nephew, his slaves and his livestock, and became a traveller and a foreigner in other people's lands and countries. And when he gets to the land of Canaan, God says to Abraham, I will give this land to your offspring. Great for them, but it leaves Abraham wandering around as a foreigner with no place to call his own. When he died, the only property, the only land, was the field where he and his wife were finally buried. And again, as we look at those first disciples, they had to pay a price, didn't they, for following Jesus? They left their families, their jobs, to follow Jesus. And later in his ministry, Jesus starts to explain, doesn't he, something more of the cost of being a disciple. He says if we want to be a disciple of his, we must give up everything, family, friends, to follow him, to put down everything, to pick up our cross and follow Jesus. And I suspect for many of us, this is one of the biggest challenges, isn't it, of responding to God's call on our lives. Are we prepared to pay the cost that comes with following Jesus? Have we given up everything to follow Jesus? Is Jesus really the be-all and end-all, the centre of our lives? Or are we holding on to things that are stopping us from fully committing to Jesus? It's easy to come up with reasons to justify why we hold on to things. But are those reasons being told to us by the world and society and not by God? In Genesis chapter 22, God says to Abraham to go and sacrifice his only son. This is the son through whom God's promise to make the great nation is to be fulfilled. But Abraham has faith in God that is prepared to pay that incredibly great cost of sacrificing his son. How many of us would have that level of faith? Fortunately, most of us are not going to be tested to that level. But responding to God's call, following Jesus as a disciple, is a costly and lifetime commitment. It's not something we can just pay lip service to, dip in and out when we want to. It's radical and life-changing. Abraham's life was radically changed when he responded to that call. And Jesus made it clear that there was a cost to being a disciple. And Jesus challenged, didn't he, his hearers, and saying that if they weren't prepared to pay the price, then becoming a disciple wasn't for them. Many, like the rich young ruler, found the cost too high and walked away. So faith has a call and a cost. But it also takes courage. Faith that's courageous. None of this is easy, is it? It wasn't easy for Abraham, and it's not easy for us. We may have the faith to believe what God has called us to do, but then we've actually got to go out and do it. When we look at Abraham's life, it took courage for him to uproot his family and go on to that journey into the unknown. It took courage to take his son up the mountain to offer as a sacrifice. It took courage to argue with God. It took courage to deal with the kings and rulers of the countries that he travelled through. And what so often stops us from being courageous is fear, isn't it? Fear can come in many forms, some real, some imagined. Fear of what may or may not happen. Fear of what people may or may not say. Fear of pain. Fear of embarrassment. The list goes on. You can add your own to that list. And maybe that's why the phrase "fear not" occurs so often in the Bible. Now, supposedly, "fear not" appears 365 times in the Bible. I suspect it depends on your translation. But it does show that God understands that what he's calling us to do is not easy, and that it will take courage. It shows us that God is standing with us through all of this. He doesn't just call us and leave us to get on with it. God is with us through all this. God doesn't abandon us. If we think about how God was with Abraham throughout his journey in his life. So when we need courage, when we're fearful, it can be good to think back and reflect on those times when God has been with us throughout our lives. Courage. The next thing that faith has and needs is commitment. Faith is about commitment. As we reflect on our lives, one thing that we often see, and we see it with Abraham, is that God's promises are not instantly fulfilled. If we go back to that first verse in the reading, faith is being sure of what we hope and certain of what we do not see. God's promise to Abraham was that he would make a great nation of him, but Abraham didn't see that promise fulfilled. That was for his descendants to see. Abraham lived his life in tents as a stranger in the land that God had promised, but he never took possession of it. A committed faith is a faith that has a long-term view, in the same way that God has a long-term view. Abraham's faith bore fruit in later generations. He didn't see the final impact of that faith. Yet we live, don't we, in a culture that expects instant gratification. But so often that's not how God works. In the 1950s, there was an American housewife who was regularly praying for the school next door and for the students there. And she committed that prayer for years. And eventually one young man was given a copy of the gospel. He went to a Billy Graham crusade and was converted. That person was George Verwer, who went on to found Operation Mobilisation. That lady committed to praying for that school, little knowing the impact that that was going to have, the thousands of lives that have been changed and saved as a result of the work of OM. One of the things that the writer of this passage implies is that that long-term commitment to things not seen is not just about earthly things, but it's also about the more important things. It's about that future prize of heaven. As the writer says, they were longing for a better country, a heavenly one. And as Christians, our faith is ultimately about our eternal salvation, about having our names written in the book of life. It's about being with God in heaven. Not something we experience within our lifetimes, but by faith we know we will experience it in the next. So our final C is faith in community. Faith that takes on a community. Abraham's call and his life didn't exist in a vacuum. There were lots of other people involved in fulfilling that promise to make a great nation of him. He was dependent not only on God, but other people to see this through. And that includes his wife Sarah, as we mentioned earlier. We're not told of Sarah's response when she found out they were setting off on this journey. But we do have her response when she was told that she would have a child. While Sarah may have laughed when she was told, as a barren 90-year-old woman, that she was about to have a child, she did have the faith to believe it. And without her faith, the promise of making the nation from Abraham's descendants wouldn't have happened. And likewise, all the other relatives and characters that Abraham deals with in his life are all part of that long-term calling. Faith works and operates in community. And as disciples of Jesus, we're dependent on God and other people. Our faith exists as part of the Christian community, as part of the church, as part of the community of believers, as part of the body of Christ. And whilst evangelical Christianity has traditionally placed emphasis on an individual and personal faith, the Bible shows us that faith is found and expressed jointly and corporately in groups. Why did Jesus send out the disciples to minister in twos and threes? Why did he say where two or three are gathered together to pray? There's power and strength, isn't there, in doing things together and not alone. Faith grows and expresses itself within community. So, 5 aspects of faith: calling, cost, courage, commitment, and community. Hopefully, what we've seen is that faith isn't some abstract theological concept, but faith is at the heart of being a Christian. It's at the heart of being a disciple of Jesus. It's at the heart of our relationship with God. And it's faith that helps us to live as strangers in this world, as we look forward to that hope that's set before us, that hope that is eternity in heaven with God.